It's difficult to overestimate the impact that artillery had on how wars are fought. From the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the massive 16-inch guns on the USS Missouri, and eventually the intimidating Long Tom batteries set into the reinforced Ferrocrete of Castles Bryan during the Star League, the use of large cannons to settle a dispute has become ubiquitous in human conflict. Today we're going to take some time to appreciate the impact that the Long Tom has had in the BattleTech universe. Though often overlooked in the focus on big stompy mechs, these artillery pieces are usually in the background, pulling more than their weight. We're going to have the opportunity to look at the weapon system itself, as well as some examples of how it's been deployed in vehicles, battle mechs, and more. Stick around and let's get into the fray. I brooded on the future battle in the desert, in the light of all the reports which I had studied of the spring fighting, and achieved a memorandum for the chiefs of staff, with the first sentence of which I was much pleased. Renown awaits the commander who first in this war restores artillery to its prime importance upon the battlefield, from which it has been ousted by heavily armored tanks. The Second World War, The Grand Alliance, by Winston Churchill. As with many of the weapon systems that we've grown to love in our big stompy mechs, the Long Tom artillery benefited from many centuries of development and refining to reach its ideal form during the Age of War. As advanced as mankind became during the 25th and 26th centuries, the need for a large-bore artillery piece persisted. It's important to note that throughout the video, as we use the term Long Tom, we do so with the understanding that it's more of a classification in which many different types and varying designs can be categorized. It's similar to the standardized AC2, 5, and 10, and 20 systems for autocannons, where there could be multiple different designs of autocannon that are all roughly grouped together as an AC5. So when we say that by 2500 the Long Tom joined weapons like the AC-10, PPC, and LRMs in wide availability, what that looked like could vary. It's also important to establish that the Long Tom artillery piece can be distinct from the vehicle, battle mech, or ship in which it's installed, even if often people refer to the traditional tracked vehicle design by the same name. After all, it's much easier to say Long Tom than the LT-MOB-25 Mobile Long Tom artillery system. Since we went there, we might as well get into it. The MOB-25 Long Tom, which became a staple of militaries across the inner sphere and periphery, was originally designed by Armstrong Industries based out of Villafranca on Baynesville 3 within the Free Worlds League. Though the Long Tom's transportation system would later be produced by a half-dozen other companies over the centuries, it did get its start with the production of the weapon itself. We're going backwards a bit out of necessity because the vehicle is almost an afterthought. Back on track. The MOB-25 system was actually multiple vehicles, one 65-ton tank, and the weight can vary, so don't yell at me, which held the Long Tom rifle, along with a cab that contained the Romtech 125 JOP 10050 LTR targeting and tracking system. Say that 10 times fast. Though not always the case, the primary vehicle was supposed to be supported by 4 additional vehicles, 2 ammunition carriages that weighed in at 10 tons apiece, roughly, and 2 more support carriages with all of the equipment and parts necessary for keeping the Long Tom operating. While the obvious play is to keep your Long Tom artillery far from the eyes and, more importantly, the ordnance of your enemies, the MOB-25 was not left completely defenseless. 4 Sperry Browning machine guns were installed into the main vehicle just in case you wanted to turn some infantry or light vehicles into a fine slurry. The Robel 190 internal combustion engine was just powerful enough to move the artillery piece from point A to point B on journeys typically measured in hours if not days. The flank speed of 32.6 kilometers per hour gave the passengers time to take stable photographs from windows. It all added up to a nice little caravan of fire and destruction. While labor-intensive and expensive to run the whole, the value of being able to lob a variety of powerful ordnance very long distances couldn't be overstated. Another stonk of Long Tom artillery roared overhead, the freight train rattle of the giant shells tearing through the air, making her 90-ton mech tremble. Jacinda looked up, imagining she could see the outgoing fire, and grinned. Battlesuits and APCs hadn't been the only thing the Atholville constabulary had pulled out of storage. A battery of artillery pieces had been set up in the city park, served by constables smiling as they wore blisters in their palms and fingers moving the heavy shells. For crowd control, Trooper Vivienne had said, smirking when Jacinda asked how the constabulary had justified holding on to the guns. Redemption Rights by Jason Schmetzer. Having established a baseline, we need to dive into just what the Long Tom rifle is capable of delivering to a battlefield near you. The weapon itself weighs in at 30 tons, with each ton of ammunition providing 5 shots. This strained the capability of battle mechs, which is why most of the time the Long Tom is reserved for heavy vehicles, ships, and permanent emplacements. Standard high-explosive munitions delivered their damage in a 3-hex blast radius, with 25 damage in the center hex, 15 delivered to any units in the adjacent hex, and 5 damage in the third band of hexes. While battlemechs could survive direct and near-direct hits, allowing incoming artillery to hit grouped-up units could be devastating. Of course, there were other options for munitions, including cluster ammo, mine-laying fast-cam rounds, and even smoke and illumination rounds, which could shift battlefield conditions when advantageous. Copperhead munitions were developed within the Terran hegemony in 2645, which allowed the trajectory of the round to be modified in flight. The technology mimicked the Arrow 4 missile tech. In fact, those who partake in the tabletop game get to use all the Arrow 4 rules for the Copperhead munitions. The damage for a hit is 15 without any damage radius. While the Copperheads were never very common due to their value and limited production, the Capellan Confederation did quote-unquote recover the ability to produce them after 3051. While they exist from then on, they aren't around in plentiful numbers. They were never supposed to see the enemy. A Long Tom fought at ranges of kilometers, not meters. On his screen, the toads were just moving blurs, but he could tell them apart from the ground. He waited, timing them at the apex of their jump, then led them a little and squeezed the trigger. The concussion of the Long Tom firing was twice what it had been when he was sheltered inside the fire direction pit, but he didn't care. The punishing impact rocked him in the too tight chair, but he held his gaze on the sight. Enrique was used to thinking in terms of time of flight. At this short range, the impact was almost instantaneous. A blossom of dirty black smoke and flame exploded beneath the descending toads. They disappeared into the cloud, but Enrique swore he had led them too far. Blake's Own, The Battle of Tukiad, by Jason Schmetzer. Quite often, the Long Tom demonstrated its worth in defensive operations. A good example of this was the Draconis Combine raid on Erai in 2888. The Kharitan raiders landed and moved quickly to secure a rich storehouse of Fedsun mechs and equipment in the city of Trent. What the Kharitans didn't expect was coordinated fire from a pair of Long Tom mobile batteries set up in the city's central square. I'm sure it all seemed like it was going well until the first high-explosive rounds started to fall in among the Kharitan ranks. Reports suggest that the barrages seriously damaged or destroyed 10 Kharitan battlemechs before the raiders were forced to fall back. The reward for the artillery came in the form of a spiteful aerospace attack that knocked out both Long Toms, but not before they were able to end the Kharitan raiding ambitions. Over and over again in the records, the ability of the long-range artillery to drop ordnance on foes made and broke operations. On Berenson, Capellans used their Long Tom to defend from the Free Worlds League assault that also employed their own artillery. In the back-and-forth exchange that reminds me of World War I for some reason, the two Long Toms lobbed shots at each other, over and over, for a week. This issue was eventually settled with saboteurs within the Capellan-held city, disabling the defending Long Tom. This tipped the balance, and ultimately the Free Worlds League forces were able to take the city. Even as the succession wars ground on and countless other weapon systems were scrapped in order to keep others functional, units that could boast of having a long tom tended to do anything they could to keep the artillery pieces functioning. Even in the cases where that was impossible, long toms were rarely scrapped or melted down in case replacement parts were found and the weapon returned to functional status. That says a lot about just how valued good artillery fire support can be, especially for the ground pounders who are calling in for support fire. She looked around the perimeter of her little outpost. 12 mechs, 2/3 of them from her 14th Roadrunner company, defined an oval about 300 meters long and half that wide. It was a consolidated perimeter. Her trebuchet and 7 others of her company faced outward, with her final 4 mechs on patrol. They shared the perimeter with Boomer Company, which consisted of 1 lance of battle mechs for anti-aircraft duties and a demi-battery of 3 long-tom mobile artillery pieces. The 3 pieces were facing southeast, so they could swing in either cardinal direction toward the anticipated and secondary enemy attack vectors, firing over the ridgelines surrounding their position. Both companies had 1 Mechwarrior in their mech at all times, with the rest either sleeping, conducting maintenance, or, she smiled as she saw her best friend lying on a beach towel next to her mech, on personal time. There is no We and Mercenary by Jason Hansa. The long toms could be found in their various forms across the inner sphere, though the most common version is the tracked LT-MOB-25 and its later variants. There are some other machines we definitely need to cover today. The first is the Fortress class of dropship, first used in 2613. The Fortress dropships were intended not just to ferry around cargo and troops, but to act as force multipliers and portable bases. Once landed, the Fortress could deploy its cargo of up to a full combined arms battalion of 12 mechs, a dozen additional heavy vehicles, and 3 platoons of soldiers, while still establishing overwatch with a series of powerful weapon systems. While the loadouts could vary dropship to dropship, the Long Tom 3 cannons stored in the ship's 4th bay could deploy and fire from the ship at anyone who presented a threat. There were also plenty of PPCs, LRMs, autocannons, and even a few lasers arranged around the outside of the ship. But reading all them out loud would take too long, so they're on the screen if you're interested. Weighing in at 6,000 tons, the Fortress dropships could throw their mass around and establish beachheads pretty easily. One of the downsides of such aggressive use was that the Fortresses took far more damage during the First and Second Succession Wars and were not easily replaced. The total number of ships declined quickly, and between the years 2973 and 3027, fewer than 24 ships were produced that could be described as Fortress class. Ultimately, the last of the production facilities was forced to close down, and the Fortresses seemed destined for extinction. It wasn't until just before the Fourth Succession War that production was restarted with an order for 20 of the dropships purchased by Archon Katrina Steiner. In the years and decades that followed, a few ships were produced each year. If you are a role player, spotting a Fortress out and about would be quite a treat. 3 days ago, a big force of clan omnimechs, along with a bunch of their second-line machines, came busting out of the woods, headed right toward our position. Why the devil the clanners decided to launch an attack right in the middle of the worst thunderstorm I'd seen in years beats the heck out of me. Right away, Hauptmann and Greer called for artillery and air support. The bigwigs back at CEF Command knew we didn't have the horsepower to hold out against a determined attack, so they sent over a couple of artillery rounds. Big stuff, mostly thumpers or maybe even long toms. I don't know. Trouble is, artillery just seems to get the clanners good and torqued off. Something to do with their sense of honor? Whatever that means. Excerpted from a letter written by Sergeant Major Rochester Craft, Coventry Militia, to his brother, 11 May 3058. If you're a big fan of boats, you're in luck, because in 2902 the Lyrans debuted the Jormungand class of naval cruisers for use in militias and water-rich planets. This 60,000-ton vessel expended a little more than half of its overall mass on a massive fusion engine, which could push the ship up to a top speed of 97.2 kilometers per hour on calm waters. 216 tons of armor provided 2,700 points of protection, which was divided up into even 300 points of armor on each side in the turrets. Similar to the dropship from earlier, the Jormungand cruisers carried a variety of weapons systems, though this time the PPCs, LRMs, and autocannons were joined by long and short-range torpedoes in the fore and aft sections. However, the stars of our show today are the 3 long toms set into the ship's turrets along with 60 tons of ammunition for them. That's 300 total if you're like me and find basic multiplication to be a bridge too far. The long toms allowed for power projection far beyond the limits of shore, and it's easy to see how even just one Jormungand cruiser could be a powerful deterrent for pirates who can't risk losing their dropship to artillery fire. I think my favorite bit of info for this ship is the refrigerated cargo space on the aft, which could hold 745 tons of cargo. That's a lot of Jeremiah's microkrill energy slurry. While we're already out on the water and slathered with sunscreen, we may as well talk about the Androsia-class bombardment frigate produced for the Capellan Confederation in the mid-3060s using hulls repurposed from ships handed over by surrendering FedSun's captains. The 8,500-ton bombardment frigates were powered by an electric fuel cell and packed with dangerous weapons. Along with a pair of LRM-20 launchers, 2 LRM-20 torpedo launchers, and a pair of ERPPCs, 2 long-tom artillery pieces were set into the pair of ship turrets. Much like the Jormungand cruisers, the Androsias could drop artillery fire far inland to support a variety of operations. When deploying VTOLs from its included landing pad in the ship's stern, few targets could hide from the long tom's high explosive munitions. Testing and sea trials were positive, though the design team did identify the ships were susceptible to attack from the air. Plans were then drawn up to team up the Androsias with a carrier to bolster its defense. "You just stay over there," Enrique muttered. He saw the toad come down behind the exterminator and gather itself for another leap. Enrique fired before the clanner could get off the ground. The flechette round was the modern descendant of an ancient canister round, packed with anti-personnel darts. It normally exploded over the ground and fired its flechettes down. Fused for direct fire, it became the world's largest shotgun. A bursting charge fired almost as soon as the round left the barrel. A flock of deadly darts washed across the pair of toads behind the exterminator's right calf. Blake's Own, The Battle for Tukiad, by Jason Schmetzer. If you're looking for a good demonstration of the long tom in action, the short story I just quoted is found within the Battle of Tukiad compilation book released back in 2021. Blake's Own describes the events which take place at the beginning of Clan Smoke Jaguar's drop into the Dinju Mountains of Tukiad. A veteran acolyte named Enrique Miranda attempts to preserve the lives of his artillery unit as the Jaguars rapidly close on their position, firing the long toms in their possession at point-blank range as well as providing fire support for advanced Comguard units. It's definitely worth a read if you're interested in seeing Tukiad from a perspective outside of a BattleMech cockpit. Now, since we've brought the clans into it, it's worth noting that the long tom use was not limited to the forces of the Inner Sphere. Long toms were included in the SLDF as well as Kerensky's Exodus fleet. In fact, there's a reference to Clan Cloud Cobra having access to 3 long tom artillery pieces during a trial of possession against the Ice Hellions on Homer in May of 3050. The prize in the fight was 6 months' production from the Elgaza's primary Omnifighter factory, and each side were determined to make a good show of it. The fight was primarily conducted in the air, but turned when an Ice Hellion Mechwarrior landed a solid shot on the Cloud Cobra Rystar Star Captain Khalid Kardan, who was forced out of the fight. The Hellions took the win, and the Cloud Cobras were humbled. Lieutenant Hollister Raven watched as the long tom fired one last barrage over the hillside. Then, unceremoniously, it tore up the sod as it beat a path out of the staging area. Raven's Centurion could feel the massive long tom rumble past, and she focused on her long-range sensors. They were out there all right. The House Merrick troops were sweeping the hills looking for her and her force. The artillery barrage had been aimed at damaging a number of their mechs, hopefully forcing them to move into the minefields that dotted the area. This was the Orient Fusiliers, after all. All she could hope for was to wear them down and run and hide. The Heart of Dixie, by Blaine Lee Pardoe. It would be a dereliction of duty as YouTube's #1 BattleTech-themed country hip-hop fusion artist if we didn't take some time to appreciate the Long Tom Cannon. Now, you might be doing a double take here, but the Long Tom Cannon was a scaled-down version of the original Long Tom artillery piece intended for use on vehicles, battle mechs, and even aerospace fighters. It was debuted in 3012 and shared characteristics of a traditional artillery piece in that it could be used to lay down indirect fire. It weighed in at 20 tons, took up 15 critical locations, and had a significantly shorter range of 20 hexes max with a minimum range of 4. It also generated 20 heat and did 20 damage on a direct hit. One of the best vehicular examples of the Long Tom Cannon in action was the Lyran-produced Rommel Howitzer project that began in 3077. Taking the base 65-ton Rommel tank frame and applying the goal of creating a vehicle that could act as a relatively swift, short-range artillery bombardment platform, the engineering team went to work cramming in the Long Tom Cannon. In order to make it possible, the 260 fusion engine had to be upgraded to an extra-light version. With the Long Tom Cannon in the turret, the Rommel could direct fire in any direction on the fly while still moving at a good clip. The Thunderbolt 5 launcher replaced the original LRM-5 on the tank to add a bit more concentrated damage at almost the same range bracket as the Long Tom Cannon. Finally, a pair of ER medium lasers set into the front of the tank provided some close-range protection should an enemy close in within the minimum range of the turret-based weapons. 4 tons of Long Tom ammunition allowed the Rommel to fire up to 20 times before needing to head back for resupply. While the Rommel Howitzer variant did eventually make it into production, it did so only after facing a brutal downgrade to a smaller standard fusion engine that dropped the movement profile to 3.5. It also had to sacrifice a half-ton of its heavy ferrofibrous armor and 1 ton of Long Tom ammunition, leaving the tank with just 15 shots, which is okay but not great. To capitalize on their initiative, the Tarantulas moved on nearby Campbellton. Flush with confidence from their victory on New Olympia, they were unprepared for what awaited them. Upon debarking from their dropships outside the capital of Ethelville, they were immediately hit by barrages of Long Tom artillery, followed by rotating hit-and-fade attacks by 2 supernova binaries. Major Gamble was badly injured when his Vulture was swarmed by wolf elementals, and Captain Norton of Bravo Company was killed by a direct cockpit hit from an artillery shell, with Bravo taking heavy losses. With Dragoon lives at a premium, the ranking officer, Captain Haya Tetsuhara, elected to withdraw. Unit Digest, Tarantulas Battalion, Shrapnel No. 16, by Zach Schwartz. There were several attempts to cram the Long Tom Cannon onto battlemechs, including a rather nasty pillager reconfiguration carried out within the Capellan Confederation, and even a notorious pirate refit of the Victor, which we'll get to at some point this year when we cover that 80-ton legend. However, the clans have been a little neglected today, so I did want to talk about the B configuration of the 65-ton Loki Mark II omnimech produced starting in 3121 by the Jade Falcons. The Loki Mark II was a derivative of the infamously powerful yet fragile Hellbringer. This new heavy omnimech benefited from Endosteel, a 260XL engine, and 9.5 tons of ferrofibrous armor, all in service to the 40 tons of pod space that could be devoted to weapons and equipment. The opportunity cost trade-off for all that pod space was a mech with just 460 movement and just 182 points of armor coverage. While the Prime and A configurations featured a predictable smorgasbord of weapons and heat sinks, the B configuration went outside the box with the installation of a Long Tom Cannon in the Loki's left arm and left torso. It was fed by 3 tons of ammunition stored in the case-protected right torso. An ER large laser was set into the right arm to provide some balance, and 4 medium pulse lasers were split between the right arm and right torso. Finally, 5 additional double heat sinks were added, bringing the total to 15. The final product was basically a heavy mech that could hit with the equivalent damage of an AC-20 out to 20 hexes, and could back it up with relatively consistent ER large laser fire. The 4 medium pulse lasers were a good insurance policy for close-range spats, or when the Long Tom ammunition ran out. Though if you live long enough to fire the cannon 15 times in the fight, you should consider buying a lottery ticket when you get back to the barracks. The defenders had one thing the Falcons had no ready answer for: long-range artillery. Snipers, thumpers, long-toms that could dump devastating barrages on the charging ground forces from ranges far beyond their ability to retaliate. Although a fierce air battle raged of aerospace fighters and VTOLs, occasionally a Falcon pilot would spot one of the giant, not very mobile launchers, stoop on it, and destroy it, usually at cost of his or her machine, if not life. Clan aerospace jocks were not decanted to die in bed, any more than their elemental or Mechwarrior comrades. Flight of the Falcon by Victor Milan. There is one more machine we need to cover before moving on, which tests the hypothesis that if one of a good thing is, well, good, then two of that thing must be even better. The Paladin defense system produced by Kallio Weapon Industries in 3109 is a good example. This 130-ton super-heavy tank crammed in not one but two long-tom artillery pieces along with 6 tons of case-protected ammunition, comms gear, a trailer hitch, and 2 ER medium lasers in the front of the vehicle. The Paladin's 260XL engine limited independent movement to a 2-3 movement profile, and it was protected by 11.5 tons of heavy ferrofibrous armor. The ability to lob 2 long-tom shells toward a target had to be overwhelmingly attractive for the planners to invest so much in this expensive design. In fact, the Paladin's production was partially impacted by its origins as a Capellan project. Only after the plans were captured on Victoria and handed over to Kallio Weapon Industries did it have much hope of ever reaching the production stage. It was likely a frustrating shock for the Capellans, who would eventually see the Paladin used against their own forces instead of aiding them. In one battle report, the Paladin ended up providing a powerful reminder that long-tom-equipped vehicles needed to be used wisely. When Draconis Combine forces visited Harrow's sun, the defending pro-Davion forces on the planet were initially blessed by the presence of a full company of Paladin defense systems, which could have been used to completely devastate the attackers. Unfortunately, the commanding Davion officer chose to attach that company to a regular armor battalion and sent them all into the fray as if they were conventional forces. Instead of raining down fire from a good distance, the Paladins were swarmed and captured without a single long-tom round being fired. The moral of the story? Protect your artillery with the ferociousness of a tree frog going after a food pellet. Go ahead and write that down. Now, as we march further down the timeline and into the Ill-Clan era, the long-tom continues to be both a guardian angel and a brutal tormentor, depending on which side of the barrel you're on that day. The original LT MOB 25 long-tom saw little tweaks here and there over the years, and the latest, designated the 25F, is now produced by at least 4 companies. Factories on Bithynia, New Avalon, Bainesville, and Stirrup produce this standardized design, which shares the original look and many of its time-tested features. The 25F's biggest change was the swap over to 3.5 tons of ferrofibrous armor to protect the vehicle. It also incorporated case into the body and dropped the onboard ammunition supply to just 2 tons. The drop in supply is inconsequential, as usually it has its support vehicles nearby. If you're looking around the record sheets, keep in mind that the mass of the vehicle does vary with the date and variant between 55 and 75 tons. It can be a little discombobulating, but it's sometimes some vehicles are included in that mass and some they're not, and you just kind of have to roll with it. The long-tom continues to be a powerful piece in the modern battlefield, even in the world of advanced tactical missile systems, Arrow 4s, and Angel ECMs. Those that underestimate the ability to lob high-explosive munitions onto targets from great distances do so at their peril. When placed in a defensive fortification, those inside sleep easier knowing that only the most determined or crafty of foes would risk an assault. In 3145, when Malvina Hazen's Jade Falcons descended upon Sinan, warnings about the Lyran's artillery assets were ignored. After all, if you're never in one place for very long, you don't have to worry about artillery, right, Malvina? That theory was put to the test by the 14th Lyran regulars, who predicted the Falcon landing zone and zeroed in with their long-tom batteries with pre-ranged fire. Just as the dropships settled down onto the planet, the high-explosive munitions began to rain down on the clanners. Quickly, the devastating damage ended the entire raid before it could even really begin. As far as the records imply, the future of the long-tom appears pretty bright. With 4 manufacturers and plenty of conflict on the horizon, these massive artillery pieces are sure to get a workout. But I'm curious what you think about this noble classic. Have you had the opportunity to use it on the tabletop? Has it worked out, or is the adulation undeserved? Let me know in the comments and we can keep the discussion going. Thanks as always for coming out today. If you think the video deserves it and you want to show your support, the easiest way to do that is to hit the like button, subscribe, and even leave a comment. All of those things make the YouTube algorithm happy. If you want to go one step further, direct support through Ko-fi or through a YouTube channel membership is a great way to help ensure that the nonsense keeps flowing. Just a couple of bucks a month can make a big difference. I can't do this without you, and I appreciate it. If you'd like to join the nonsense on the MechFrog Discord channel, we'd love to see you. I've included a link to the server in the video notes. It's the best way to find out what's coming each week, talk to BattleTech fans, share your awesome mech paint jobs, and otherwise hang out with some pretty amazing people. With that, I'll say have a great week, take care of yourselves, and please go out and make the world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.